iron was cold under her palm, though the hearth beside it had been burning since noon. She kept her hand there longer than she needed to, the way she always did, as if the metal remembered something her mind was only now getting around to saying out loud. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and simmering broth, of onions gone soft in bacon fat, and outside the window, the sky over the ranch had turned the color of a bruise healing, that low autumn orange that comes right before the cold settles in for good. The girl sat at the table with her sleeve pulled down over her arm, the way she'd been pulling it down all evening, ever since she'd come home from school, with her chin tucked and her eyes red-rimmed, and refusing every question put to her at supper. She hadn't answered until the dishes were cleared. Even then, it had come out sideways, the way children's hurts often do. Not the wound itself, but the shape of it, offered up in pieces. Someone had seen the mark on her arm. Someone had said a word that wasn't kind. The old woman had not asked which someone, nor what word. She had simply reached over and turned the girl's wrist gently, the way she might have turned a young calf's leg to check for a break, and looked at the birthmark there a long moment without her face changing at all. Then she had risen, slow on the hip that always complained in the cold, and crossed to the door where the iron sign hung. The one that had hung there longer than the girl had been alive, longer than the girl's father had been alive, black with age and stamped deep with the shape of an open hand. "They wouldn't let me near the fire once," she said now, her fingers still resting against the metal. "Not this one, another one. A long time before you, before your grandfather even, before any of it." The girl looked up. Something in her had gone still, the way a barn goes still when the wind changes outside it. "A rich man's hunger changed that," the old woman said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the flat certainty of a fact long since made peace with. She said it the way she might have said the winter of the fever, or the year the well went dry, a marker of time, not a wound reopened. She did not sit down yet. She stood with her back to the fire and her scarred hand still against the sign, and for a moment, she seemed to be listening to something the girl couldn't hear. Wagon wheels, maybe, or wind across a valley long since fenced and settled and turned to pasture. "Pull that chair closer," she said finally. "This one takes a while in the telling. It always has." Outside, the last light went out of the sky, and the fire in the hearth popped once, sending up a small bright shower of sparks, the way it always did when the old woman told this particular story, as if the flames themselves remembered being refused. The girl pulled the chair closer, the legs scraping soft against the plank floor, and settled into it with her knees drawn up under her chin, the sleeve of her dress still damp from where she'd scrubbed at her eyes on the walk home. She was looking at the hands now, not the sign. She had seen them her whole life, had held onto two of those fingers crossing the creek, had watched them roll dough and knead lard into flour 1,000 mornings, but she had never once asked. Children rarely ask about the things that have always simply been there. It takes a wound of their own to make them curious about someone else's. "Why do they look like that?" the girl said. Not unkindly, just plain, the way children ask things, wanting the fact of it, and nothing softened. The old woman turned her palms up, slow, and studied them herself for a moment, as though she too were seeing them fresh. The scars ran pale and puckered across both, thick ropes of old burn tissue that had long since stopped paining her, though the cold still found them first every winter, and told her so before she saw the frost on the window. "Fire took them," she said. "Same fire took my husband. I was 21 years old, and it was the 4th of September, 1861, and we were 3 weeks out from a river crossing on the road west, and I have never in my life since trusted a wagon axle that creaked." She did not soften it, and she did not linger on it either. She said it the way a woman recites the boundaries of her own field. Worn from walking them so many times, there was no longer any grief left in the saying, only the shape of the thing. "There was a woman on that train," she went on, "the captain's wife, and she looked at these hands of mine, across a cook fire one morning, and told the others I was marked. Unlucky. Said it plain, in front of God, and the wagons both, like she was reading weather. A small breath left her, not quite a laugh. And for a good while, most everyone believed her. The fire popped again behind her, and she did not turn to it this time. But there was hunger enough on that trail to make liars out of superstition, she said. And a rich man's belly, in the end, cared less for what my hands looked like than what came out of them. She lowered herself into the chair across from the girl at last, her knees complaining the way they always did on cold nights, and folded those same hands in her lap, scarred palm over scarred palm, as if settling something old back into place. It started, she said, on a morning so cold the water bucket had skinned over with ice, and nobody at that fire would so much as look at me. The train had left the Missouri crossing in the first week of September, when the grass still held some green in it, and the oxen had flesh enough on their ribs to argue with the yoke. By the time the mornings turned to ice skin on the water buckets, 6 weeks had passed, and the grass had gone the color of old rope, and the oxen had learned not to argue at all. 41 wagons, canvas gone the gray of every other thing on the trail, the dust, the sky before dawn, the men's coats, the children's faces. The dust did not fall so much as live with them, settling into flour sacks and Bible pages and the creases of a woman's knuckles, and no one ever really got the taste of it out of their mouth, not at breakfast, not at supper, not in dreams. She was not idle in those weeks. A wheel had split its fellow on a limestone shelf 2 days out from the last trading post, and while the men stood arguing over whether to abandon the wagon or strip it for parts, she had knelt in the wagon rut mud with a borrowed awl and a coil of rawhide, and bound the crack tight enough to hold 300 more miles, which it did. She was the one who figured, without a ledger, how far the flour would stretch if it was cut with cornmeal 2 days in 5, and told the families so, plainly, and was proven right when October came and other wagons ran short. She was, in short, useful in the particular way that goes unremarked until it is absent, the way a person only notices a fence post when it falls. She kept to herself at the mending and the measuring. It was easier that way. Her sleeves stayed long even in the sun, buttoned tight at the wrist, and if anyone thought it strange that a woman would suffer heavy wool through an Indian summer noon, they did not yet say so aloud. She had learned, in the year since the fire, to move through a camp the way a person moves through a room with a sleeping child in it, careful, quiet, taking up as little space as the work would allow. It was the mornings that betrayed her in the end, not the noons. The cold drove the wool up past her wrists before she thought to stop it, reaching for the coffee pot at the shared fire before the camp had properly woken, and it was there, in that gray hour, with the ice still skinning the buckets, that the captain's wife had looked down and seen what the sleeves usually hid, and had gone very still, the way a person goes still, around something she has decided, before a word is spoken, to be afraid of. The fire had happened 3 months before, in the last week of June, when the grass was still green enough to fool a person into thinking the crossing would be easy. A wheel had split on a stone the size of a fist. That was all, a stone the size of a fist, and an axle that had been complaining since Missouri, and a lantern hung too close to the canvas because the night had come on cold, and someone had wanted light to see the mend by. He had gone under the wagon with the tools while she held the lantern above him, and the wick had guttered, and in reaching to trim it, she had brushed the canvas, and the canvas had brushed the flame, and after that, there was no more holding anything steady. She did not remember screaming. She remembered the smell, which she would carry the rest of her life the way some people carry a scripture verse. Tallow and hair and dry cottonwood, all at once, all wrong. She remembered her husband's hands closing over hers, pulling them from the burning canvas before her own mind had thought to do it, and how that had cost him the higher part of his arm, and 3 days later, his life, when the wound soured, despite the doctor's poultices, and the whiskey, and the prayers of women who had not yet decided to be afraid of her. She had lived. Her hands had lived, though the skin across both palms and up the inside of each wrist had drawn tight and shining, the color of a scar on an apple, ridged in places like the surface of a dried creek bed. She had buried him on a rise above the Platte, with a wooden marker that would not survive 2 winters, and she had gone on, because the train did not stop for grief, and because there was nothing behind her worth going back to. What she had not accounted for was the arithmetic other people would make of it. A husband dead in a fire he was trying to save her from, and her hands marked as proof of the trying. That should have been, she thought, a plain enough sorrow, the kind any Christian body could sit with. But grief on the trail curdled fast into superstition, the way milk curdled in the heat, and by the time the wagons had crossed into the high plains, someone had begun saying, low at first and then not so low, that a woman who carried fire on her own hands carried it wherever she went next. The captain's wife did not say the word marked in that gray hour by the coffee pot. She did not have to. She only looked, and stepped back half a pace, the way a person steps back from a stove they are no longer certain has gone cold, and that half a pace traveled through the camp faster than any words could have. The old woman remembered it came the next morning, dressed up as practicality, because cruelty on the trail always wore the clothes of good sense. The captain's wife called the women together at the fire, before the coffee had finished boiling, and she said it plain, the way a person reads out a rule that has always existed, rather than one she has just decided upon. There would be one fire, she said, for the decent families to cook at, and it would be tended by turns among women whose houses were whole. She did not look at the scarred hands when she said it. She looked instead at the tin cup in her own hand, turning it, as though the matter were beneath the trouble of a direct glance. Bad luck rode easier in a wagon that kept its distance, she said, and there had been enough trouble already crossing this stretch of ground. A lamed ox, a fever 2 wagons back, a wheel split on nothing but flat prairie, for anyone to go inviting more. Impropriety too, she added, for a widow alone to press in among married women at their cooking, as though grief itself were a kind of trespass. Nobody argued. A few of the younger women looked down at their own hands, plain and unmarked, and were grateful in a way they would not have admitted aloud. She had stood at the edge of that circle with her kettle already lifted, ready to set it among the others, and she had felt the whole weight of the decision land on her before a single word was spoken directly to her. That was the particular cruelty of it, she told her granddaughter years later, that they had discussed her like weather, like a thing to be routed around rather than reasoned with, and she had been made to stand there and receive the verdict as though she were not owed even the dignity of being spoken to. She did not cry. She had promised herself somewhere back at the fire that took her husband that she would not give this journey her tears twice over, and she held to that the way a person holds to a rail crossing ice. She set the kettle back down. She said nothing, because there was nothing that would not sound like begging, and begging was a door she had already decided not to open, not even a crack. She walked back to her own wagon with her spine straight and her scarred hands loose at her sides, and she did not look back to see whether anyone watched her go, though she felt the eyes all the same, the particular itch of being observed by people who have just agreed among themselves that you are no longer quite a person to be greeted. Under the wagon, in the shadow between the wheels, a small shape shifted and went still, waiting to see what her face would tell him before he dared to speak. She crouched at the wheel and did not reach for him right away. She had learned that much already, in 3 weeks of watching him watch her, that a hand offered too quickly was a hand he would flinch from, the way a dog flinches that has been struck by hands that once fed it. So she only lowered herself down into the dirt beside the wheel, slow, the way she might approach a spooked horse, and let the silence do the first part of the work. He was small for what she guessed to be 9 years, all wristbone and collarbone, his shirt gone the color of the road dust it had been dragged through. His eyes were the thing she could not get used to, how old they sat in that young a face, how they took the measure of a grown woman crouching near him and found, apparently, that she would do, for now, for tonight, provisionally. She had found him the second night out from the last fort, curled into the shadow beneath her wagon bed, like something that had been poured there and left to set. She had not screamed. She had only gone still herself, and after a long while she had set down a heel of bread within his reach and gone to sleep, pretending she had not seen him, because she understood, without being told, that being caught mattered more to him than being fed. He had not run. That was the first thing she had learned about him. Tonight, she brought the last of what she had, a strip of dried meat, tough as harness leather, and a spoonful of cold cornmeal mush she had held back from her own scant plate, and she set it on the wagon step and sat back on her heels and waited. He ate the way he always ate, with his shoulder half turned toward her, ready to bolt, one hand curled protectively around the food, as though the dirt itself might try to take it from him. She asked him nothing. She had asked, the first days, gentle things, his name, where he had come from, who he belonged to, and he had gone rigid and silent each time, like a door swinging shut, until she had stopped asking altogether and let him arrive at speech in his own season, if he arrived at all. She knew only what the fort's blacksmith had told her in passing, that a fever had gone through a family camped 2 nights out, that it had taken a mother and then a father inside the same week, and that the boy had simply not been where anyone expected him to be buried, or claimed, or grieved. She watched him finish the mush and lick the tin clean with a thoroughness that told her more than any words could have, that hunger like his did not trust that more would come tomorrow. She thought of the fire that had taken her own husband, and of the particular arithmetic of loss, how it left different marks on different people, some visible, some not. She did not reach for the boy's hand. She only stayed sitting there in the dark beside the wheel, so that he would know, without her saying it, that he was not required to be alone in it tonight. The name came to her only in pieces, the way the blacksmith had given it, not from the boy himself, who offered nothing beyond the tin held out for more, and the silence that followed refusal. 3 weeks, the blacksmith had said, counting on his fingers, as though the number mattered more than the boy did. 3 weeks since the fever camp, 3 weeks since 2 graves had gone into ground somewhere back along the trail, with no stone to mark either, and no wagon willing to carry a child who did not belong to it. The train had rolled on because trains did not stop, because a schedule written in some distant office cared nothing for orphan boys, and because it was easier, she understood, to leave a problem behind in the dust than to solve it in the daylight, where everyone could see the solving. She sat with that knowledge the way she sat with most things now, turning it slowly, feeling its weight before she let it settle. She had almost nothing. Her own stores had thinned to what could be measured in handfuls: a heel of cornmeal, a twist of salt, the last of the dried apples she had been rationing since the 2nd week out. She had told herself she would make it stretch to the mountains. She had not planned on stretching it further than that. But she thought of the tin scraped clean, the boy's tongue working the corners of it like there might be one more grain hiding where the metal met the rim, and something in her chest set itself like a bone knitting crooked but sure. She was not a woman with authority to grant. She had no fire of her own to offer him a place at, no name to speak for him at the captain's wagon, no standing that would make anyone look twice if she claimed him. What she had was a pot, and hands that could still work even scarred, and a memory of what it was to be told there was no room for her either. She did not decide it the way a person decides a large thing, with ceremony or resolve spoken aloud. She decided it the way a woman decides to keep walking when her feet have gone past hurting, simply by continuing. The next morning, she portioned the cornmeal into 2, not 1. She said nothing about it, and he asked nothing. But when she set the 2nd share down within his reach, and turned back to her own wagon without waiting to see if he'd take it, she heard, behind her, the particular quiet sound of a boy eating carefully, as if trying not to be noticed, doing the one thing that might get him sent away. She did not turn around, she let him have that. The old woman, telling it now, said that a stew is a kind of ledger. You put into it what the day has given you, and it tells you back, honestly, what the day was worth. Some nights the ledger was thin. She would walk the margins of the camp before dark, where the grass grew wild and unclaimed by anyone's wagon, and she would kneel there with her ruined hands moving through the stalks, until she found the pale green shoots of wild onion, and she would pull them the way her own mother had taught her, twisting rather than yanking, so the bulb came whole. She kept a bone from 3 nights back, boiled once already until the marrow had given up what it had, and she boiled it again, because a bone that has given once has not always given everything. The boy learned to find the onion faster than she did. He had a child's eyes, low to the ground, quick to notice what a grown woman's eyes passed over. He never spoke while he searched. He would simply appear beside her, crouched, and lay what he'd found in her lap without a word, and she would nod without looking up, and that was the whole of the conversation. She showed him too how to tell dried corn that still had good in it from corn gone to must, by smell and by the way it sat in the hand. The good kernels heavier somehow, though they weighed the same as the bad, or so it seemed to her, and she never could explain to him why, only that a person learned to feel it after enough winters of being wrong about it once. She showed him how a fire wants to be built small and mean when there is little to feed it, how a low flame kept low on purpose will outlast a proud one. He listened the way hungry children listen, entirely, with his whole small body still. They did not speak of his parents, they did not speak of her hands. There was an agreement between them that ran under the words they did use, the way a creek runs under ice. Present, moving, but not to be looked at directly. She noticed he had begun to walk closer to her wagon during the day, not beneath it as before, but alongside it, and she noticed he had stopped flinching when her sleeve rode up and showed the scarred wrist beneath. He watched her portion the meal each night with the solemn attention of a boy studying arithmetic he meant to remember, and once, only once, he took the second share and, before eating, set a single kernel of the good corn back into her palm, as if returning something borrowed, as if he had counted and found she'd taken less for herself than she ought, and he meant, in whatever language a starving 9-year-old had left to him, to correct the sum. She set the kernel back into the pot without a word, because there was nothing to say to a boy correcting arithmetic with his own hunger, and some corrections are better honored than argued. The nightmares came on the 4th night after that, and she learned the shape of them before she understood their cause. He did not cry out. That was the worst of it. A child screaming would have been a mercy, something she could answer with a hand on the shoulder and a voice pitched low. Instead, he went rigid under the wagon, his breath coming fast and shallow through his nose, his small fists working at the blanket she'd given him, as though he were trying to fold it into something that would hide him entirely. She lay awake listening to that breathing change, quicken, catch, and she understood without being told that he was back in a wagon that smelled of fever and tallow candles, watching people who loved him stop being able to answer when he spoke to them. She did not wake him. She had learned that much from her own grief, that a person pulled too soon from the place their mind has gone to hide sometimes cannot find their way back to the surface at all, and drowns twice. She only moved her bedroll closer, so that if he woke he would find her there, solid and unafraid, and after a while his breathing eased on its own, the way water finds its level. In the mornings he never spoke of it, but she began to notice the fear that lived under his ordinary hours, the way he counted the wagons ahead of hers each dawn, as if reassuring himself the train had not left in the night, the way his eyes went to the captain's wife whenever that woman passed near, flinching from a cruelty aimed at another that he seemed to feel could just as easily turn and find him. He was 9 years old and had already learned that belonging was a temporary arrangement, granted and withdrawn at the pleasure of people who owed him nothing. He watched Martha the way a man watches weather he cannot control, hopeful, careful, ready to be wrong. She began to understand that what she was feeding him under that wagon each night was not only jackrabbit and dried corn stretched thin over a low flame. She was feeding him the idea that a meal could be counted on, that a person could return to the same fire each evening and find it still burning. It was a small thing to offer a child who had lost everything else, but she had little else in her power to give, and she gave it with the same care she gave to the boiling of a bone twice over, understanding that some flavors only come out slow, and only for those patient enough to wait on them. She told her granddaughter that the second outfit had been there for 3 days before anyone in the wagon train paid it much mind. A smaller camp set apart on the far side of the creek, with its own fires and its own wagons, tidier and better provisioned than anything the train itself could claim. The old woman said you could tell wealth by the way it kept its distance, the way it did not need to mix with lesser company to prove itself. There were near 40 head of cattle grazing loose beyond the camp, watched by drovers who rode fine horses and wore boots that had never known a week of mud. She remembered the smell of that camp carrying on the wind some evenings, coffee, real coffee, and meat cooking in quantities the train families could only imagine, and how the smell had made the orphan boy go still and quiet beside her, the way a starving thing goes still when food is near, but not for him. The man who owned all of it, she said, was called Judd, though she did not yet know that name, only knew him as a shape on a horse at the edge of camp, broad-shouldered and silver-templed, watching his outfit with the settled patience of a man who had never once had to raise his voice to be obeyed. His drovers spoke of him the way men speak of weather that has always been fair to them, with a kind of casual gratitude that assumes the sun will keep rising. She remembered thinking, from that distance, that he looked like a man untouched by the trail's smaller cruelties, a man for whom hunger and cold were simply things that happened to other people. But even wealth traveled with its weaknesses, she told her granddaughter, and this one traveled in the shape of a cook, a thin, sour-faced man named for nothing she ever learned, who had fed that outfit well enough for the first stretch of the crossing but had begun, in the last days, to move slower around his own fire, to sweat through cool mornings, to set down his ladle more than he lifted it. She had seen it herself once, gathering water near the creek's bend, where the two camps' paths crossed without quite touching, the man swaying over his pot, gray in the face, his hands trembling on the handle of a spoon he could not seem to keep steady. No one from that fine camp had looked at him twice. A cook was furniture to men like that, she said, useful until it broke, and then simply replaced. She had gone back to her own small fire that evening and said nothing of it to anyone, because it was not her business, and because a woman barred from one fire had no standing to comment on another's. But she remembered thinking, low and private, that sickness did not care how much a man was worth, and that somewhere close by, hunger was about to meet its match in a kitchen no one yet knew to look toward. The cook did not last the week. He went down on a morning thick with fog, the kind that beaded on the wagon canvas and dripped in slow fat drops onto the wheel spokes, and by midday, word had traveled through the fine camp the way bad news traveled everywhere on the trail, sideways, through mouths that did not want to be the ones carrying it. He had tried to stand at his fire and could not. He had tried to lift the coffee pot and set it down again, both hands shaking so badly the tin rang against the rock. Then he had folded, quiet as a tent losing its pole, and two drovers had carried him to his bedroll, where he lay after that, with his eyes half open and his skin the color of ash under grease. The old woman said that for 2 days after, the fine outfit ate badly. She said this the way she said most things about that camp, without relish, only fact, the way a person reports weather. The drovers ate hardtack gone soft with damp and salt pork fried black by men who had never fried anything in their lives, and by the second evening, there was grumbling loud enough to carry across the creek. Men who worked cattle from dark to dark, needing more than burnt meat to keep their arms swinging an axe or a rope. A trail crew ran on food, the way a wagon ran on grease, she said. Starve the grease and everything ground down to a halt, no matter how much silver a man carried in his saddlebags. It was the foreman who broke first. He was a lean, sun-cracked man named for his temper more than his height, and he had spent those 2 days watching morale sour like milk left in the sun. He went from fire to fire in the wider camp, first to his own drovers who only shrugged and gestured toward the sick man's tent, then further out, past the wagons of families who had their own mouths to feed and no spare hands, asking the question plainly each time. Did anyone here know how to cook, truly cook, not just boil enough to keep from starving? He was turned away twice, then 3 times, the answers polite but thin. He crossed near the creek's bend, where the two camps' paths met without quite touching, and there he stood a moment, hat pushed back, looking down the line of wagons with the particular weariness of a man who has run out of easy places to look. The old woman remembered watching him from a distance, remembered the boy beside her, going still and small, the way he always did around strange men, remembered thinking that a question was moving through the camp, like smoke, looking for a draft to follow. She did not step forward. She only watched, and waited, and stirred the thin pot in front of her, not yet knowing that the draft the smoke wanted was hers. The foreman, for his part, did not think to cross that invisible seam between the camps until his own asking had failed him everywhere else, and so it was that he came at last to the fire where the trail captain's wife sat with her circle of women, mending and talking low, the smell of their supper, a pale, watery beans and salt pork thing, hanging thin over the coals. He took off his hat before he spoke, the old woman remembered, because he had been raised somewhere that men did that for women even when they were asking for help, and he asked his question plainly, the same one he had carried down the whole camp. Did anyone here cook well enough to feed a sick man's outfit for a week or more, and would they? There was a silence that the old woman, watching from her distance, could read even without hearing the words in it. A silence made of glances passed sideways, of needles pausing over cloth, of someone drawing breath to speak and then not speaking. The captain's wife was the one who finally answered, and she answered generously, in the way that costs nothing to give. She said she herself could turn out a decent pot of beans, and so could 2 or 3 others in her circle, and she named them, and the named women nodded, with the particular modesty of people accepting a compliment they had angled for. She did not once let her eyes drift toward the far fire where the widow sat with her boy and her thin pot of scraps. None of them did. It was not forgetfulness. The old woman was certain of that even 41 years later, certain in the way a person is certain of a bruise's exact shape long after the color has faded. It was not forgetfulness. It was a small, deliberate closing of a door, the same door that had been closed at the cook fire on the first night out, only quieter now, dressed up in politeness instead of open scorn. The foreman thanked them and moved on, no wiser, his hat back on his head, his shoulders set with the particular tiredness of a man circling the same field twice. He passed near the creek again on his way back, close enough that the old woman, stirring her pot, could have called out and settled the whole matter herself with 4 words. She did not. She had learned by then, in the weeks since the fire had first turned the women's faces from her, that offering herself where she had not been asked only bought her more of the same refusal, dressed in whatever manners the moment required. So she let him walk past, let the smoke of her own small fire climb up thin and unremarkable into the cooling evening air, and told herself, the way she had told herself many times already on that crossing, that hunger, given enough time, asks its own questions, and does not much care who it has to ask them of. The boy had been crouched at the edge of the willow brush when the foreman passed the second time, close enough to hear the man mutter to himself about fools and fevers and the price of a good cook gone to bed with the shakes. The boy had learned, in 3 weeks of living beneath a wagon bed and eating what was slipped to him after dark, that the safest place for a child with no name anyone bothered to ask was silence. He had kept to it at the first cook fire, kept to it through the long days of dust and the longer nights of cold, kept to it even when the women's voices sharpened around the widow's name like knives being drawn across a stone. But hunger, it seemed, was not the only thing that grew impatient with waiting. He came out from the brush before he had decided to, the way children do, moved by something faster than thought. The foreman turned, startled, his hand going instinctively to the knife at his belt before he saw how small the interruption was. The boy did not look at him directly. He had not yet learned to look grown men in the eye and ask for anything, only to state facts and let them do what they would with the stating. "Her stew," he said, "is the best I've had since my mother." He said it plain, the way a boy says the sky is blue or the creek is cold, without ornament, without pleading, and that plainness was its own kind of proof. The foreman studied him, noted the too large coat that had belonged to some larger boy or man now dead, the collarbone sharp beneath a shirt gone thin at the seams, the careful stillness of a child who had learned that stillness kept him fed and unseen both. "Whose fire?" the foreman asked, though he already knew, though the smoke not 30 yards off told him plain enough. The boy pointed anyway. It seemed important to him that the pointing be done, that credit be given, where the women at the main fire had refused to give it. The foreman looked toward the smoke a long moment. He was not a sentimental man. Sentiment did not keep an outfit fed on a 6-week drive. But he was a hungry man, and a tired one, and he had asked 6 women a version of the same question and gotten 6 versions of the same closed door, and here now was a boy with hollow cheeks offering him an answer nobody had asked to give. "You ate there before?" The boy nodded. "Regular?" Another nod, smaller this time, as though admitting to a secret he was not entirely sure he was allowed to keep. The foreman looked once more at the smoke, then down at the boy, and something in his tired face shifted. Not quite decision yet, but the loosening that comes just before it. The moment a man circling a field finally notices the gate he'd walked past twice already. "Show me," he said. The old woman remembered that the boy had walked faster than his legs seemed built to carry him, out ahead of the foreman by 3 strides, glancing back every so often to make sure the man was still following, as if he feared the offer might dissolve if left unwatched too long. She remembered watching them come, the boy first, then the foreman's tall shape behind him, dust rising thin around their boots in the low light. She had been kneeling by the fire, feeding it the last of the sagebrush she'd gathered that morning, and her first thought, she told her granddaughter, was not hope, it was dread. She had thought, here it comes again. Another face come to look at her hands and find them wanting. She had risen anyway, because kneeling before a stranger felt like something she was not willing to do twice in one day, and she had wiped her palms on her apron out of habit, though there was nothing on them to wipe. The scars did not come off, she knew that. She wiped them anyway. The foreman stopped a respectful distance from the fire and did not look at her hands first. He looked at the pot. That, she said, was the thing she noticed, that his eyes went to the food before they went to her, which was more than most men on that train had managed in 3 weeks. He asked, plain, no softening in it, whether she had stew enough to spare, and enough to spare quick, because his outfit's cook had gone down with fever somewhere past the last river crossing, and Mr. Judd's drovers had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. She did not answer right away. She remembered the morning fire, the captain's wife's voice pitched to Carrie, the word. Marked? Passed hand to hand among women who would not meet her eyes even while speaking of her. She remembered thinking that if she gave this stranger her food, and he found some new way to shame her with it, she would have handed him the weapon herself. But the boy was watching her with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that his next meal depends on what adults decide when they think he isn't paying attention, and she found she could not disappoint that stillness twice in one day either. "I've a pot," she said. "Wild onion and rabbit. Corn dried hard, had to soak it. Bone boiled twice for what body'd give the broth." She said it plain, the way she'd say a fact of weather, offering no apology for the poverty of it, and no dressing up either. The foreman studied her a moment, something unreadable working behind his tired eyes, and then he nodded once, short, like a man closing a deal he hadn't fully decided he wanted to make. "Bring it," he said. "Quick as you can." She remembered the walk back to her own fire as the longest short distance she had ever crossed, the pot heavy in both hands, heat coming through the cloth wrapped around the handles, and finding the old scars anyway, the way heat always did, as if it recognized kin. The boy trailed a few steps behind her, silent, carrying nothing because she would not let him carry the one thing that mattered. The rich man's fire was bigger than any on the train, built up with wood that had been paid for rather than gathered, and he sat near it on a folded blanket, with the particular stillness of a man who has been told too many times that he is important to bother proving it. He did not stand when she approached. He barely looked up. His foreman set the pot down near his boot and said something low she didn't catch, and the rich man made a sound in his throat that might have been agreement or might have been dismissal, and for a moment she thought he would not taste it at all, that the whole walk and the whole risk would end in a bowl going cold at a stranger's feet while he talked business with someone else. Then he reached for the ladle himself. She remembered the way he did it, unhurried, almost bored, a man performing a courtesy he expected to regret. He filled the spoon and blew across it once, the steam bending and scattering in the cold air, and she remembered how long that breath seemed to last, how the whole camp behind her seemed to have gone quiet, though she knew later it hadn't, that the noise of drovers and stock and wind had simply stopped mattering to her ears. He put the spoon to his mouth. She watched his face the way she had once watched weather come over the western ridge, for the small signs before the larger change, a tightening at the jaw, stillness in the eyes, the particular pause of a man recalculating something he had believed settled. He did not say anything. He held the broth on his tongue a moment longer than a man tastes food he intends to complain about, and then he swallowed, and looked down into the pot as if it might explain itself, and looked up at her instead. "Who taught you this?" he said. Not a compliment. Not yet. A question asked the way a man asks, "Who owns a horse?" he is suddenly interested in buying. She did not answer right away. 41 years later, she still could not say for certain whether her silence in that moment had been fear or pride, only that it had felt, standing there with her ruined hands loose at her sides, and the boy pressed against her skirt, like the first question anyone on that whole crossing had asked her that assumed she might have an answer worth hearing. "My mother," she said finally, "and hers before that. It was the truth, though it was not the whole of it. The whole of it was harder years than a man wanted standing in his supper line, and she did not offer that part." He did not press her. He looked instead at the foreman, who was still working his way through his own bowl, with the single-minded attention of a man who has stopped thinking about anything but the food in front of him, and something passed over his face that she would come, in later years, to recognize as the particular satisfaction of a man watching his judgment proven correct by someone else's hunger. "Where is she?" he said. Not to her, to the foreman, to the fire, to the camp at large, as though the question had weight enough to be asked, of the whole gathered outfit, rather than settled quietly between two people. The foreman looked up, spoon still in hand, and pointed with his chin toward the far side of the wagons, where her fire had long since burned to coals, and the boy had gone still and watchful in the shadow of the wheel. Mr. Judd set down the pot. He did not send a man to fetch her. He did not call across the camp the way the trail captain's wife had once called instructions to be relayed, second-hand, as if direct address might contaminate. He stood, brushed the trail dust from his knees, and walked. The camp had gathered by then. Word of a rich man's cook falling ill traveled faster than fever itself, and so there were eyes on him as he crossed the open ground between the wagons, boots loud in the hush that fell as people understood what was happening. She watched him come the way she had watched him taste the broth, for the signs. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He walked the way a man walks, to something he has decided is worth the walking, and every step of it was visible to the same women who had turned their backs on her not 3 weeks before, who now stood with bowls half lifted, forgetting to eat. He stopped in front of her wagon, close enough that she had to look up at him, though not so close as to crowd her, and she understood, even then, before he said a word, that he had chosen the distance carefully, a man used to giving orders who had decided for once to ask instead. "That's your fire," he said, nodding at the coals. "It is," she said. He looked at her hands then, the scarred ridges of them hanging loose at her sides where she had not thought to hide them, and he did not flinch, and he did not soften his face into the kind of pity she had grown a hard skin against, and it was that, more than the tasting, more than the question of her mother, that she would remember longest. He asked how long she had boiled the bone. "Twice," she said. "Once for the marrow, once for the strength left after." He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected, and she felt the old caution rise in her, the one that had kept her upright through 3 weeks of turned backs, the waiting for the pity to show itself, for the kindness to curdle into something that asked nothing of him and cost her everything. "Wild onion," he said, "not the kind that grows by the river. The river kind's bitter this time of year. I took it off the south slope, where the frost hasn't touched it. You went out alone for it." It was not a question, but she answered it as one. "I go out alone for most things." He crouched then, without asking leave, and looked into the pot as though it might tell him something further, though it was near empty and cooling fast in the evening air. She watched his hands, clean, unscarred, a rancher's hands that had likely not skinned a rabbit in a decade, and thought of her own hanging at her sides, and made herself not move them, not tuck them away, not give him the satisfaction of watching her shame herself first. "The corn," he said, "dried it yourself. Last season, before." She did not finish the sentence. He did not ask her to. "You didn't have salt pork in that." "I had none to have." He looked up at her then, and something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but sharpened, the way a man's face sharpens when a sum comes out right that he had expected to come out wrong. Most cooks I've paid good wages to couldn't make a broth taste of anything without a slab of pork to hide behind. Then you've been paying for the pork, she said, and not the cook. It was bolder than she'd meant to be, bolder than the trail had left room for in 3 weeks, of small words and smaller meals, and she braced herself for the offense of it to cross his face. It did not. Something close to the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth and then thought better of itself and went still again, and he stood, unhurried, brushing dust from his knee, though there was none to speak of. "Your husband teach you to cook like that?" he asked. "Or your mother?" "My mother," she said. Before the fever took her. He said nothing to that, and she was grateful for it. Grateful he did not reach for a word of sympathy he had no right to offer a stranger. Grateful he let the fact sit between them plain and unadorned, the way she had learned to let all her facts sit, because dressing them up had never once made them lighter to carry. Behind him, she heard the trail captain's wife murmur something low to the woman beside her, and she did not need to hear the words to know their shape. He turned back to her then, and the smile that had almost come now settled fully, though it stayed small, a man's smile that had not been used often. $12 a month, he said. Your own wagon, full charge of my outfit's kitchen the rest of the drive. What we eat, when we eat it, how it's rationed. My foreman answers to you on matters of food, same as he answers to me on matters of cattle. He said it the way another man might read a bill of sale, flat and businesslike, no flourish in it, and that was somehow what made her believe him. She looked past him at the fire that was not hers, at the pot that was not hers, at the boy, crouched near her wagon wheel, with his knees drawn up and his eyes gone wide and still, watching her, the way a person watches weather that might turn. She thought of the 21 days since the crossing began. She thought of the captain's wife's voice saying, "Marked." The way another woman might say, "Diseased." She thought of her hands, and what they had always been able to do even when nothing else in her life had held. "And if your cook recovers," she said, "what then?" "Then I've got 2 cooks and a fool's worth of good luck," he said. "You let me worry on that." She did not answer right away. The wind came up off the flats and moved the smoke sideways, and somewhere behind her, a woman coughed the small dry cough of the trail, and it seemed to her that the whole camp had gone quiet in the particular way a camp goes quiet when it senses something has shifted beneath it, though not one soul there could have said what. She thought of walking back to that fire tomorrow morning with a pail of water and being told, again, to keep her distance. She thought of the boy eating jackrabbit bones in the dark, because that was all there was to give him. She thought that a woman could spend her whole life waiting to be asked twice for what she was worth, and that no one, in her experience, was ever asked twice. "I'll want the boy fed from your stores," she said, "same as your men." Judd glanced toward the wagon wheel, toward the thin shape crouched in its shadow, and something crossed his face that was not quite surprise. "Done," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron, though they were already clean, because it gave her something to do with the moment before she said the word that would take her out from under the captain's authority, and into a debt she did not yet understand the size of. "Then I accept," she said. He did not offer his hand on it, as men sometimes did to seal a bargain, and she was glad of that, for she did not know yet whether he would want to feel the ridges of her palm against his own, and she did not want to learn the answer to that question on the same night she had learned so many others. Instead, he called out, "Lo," toward one of his drovers, and told him to bring the boy out from under the wheel, and to bring him easy, like he was calling a colt that had never been haltered. The boy came slow. He kept his eyes on Martha the whole way, as if she were the only fixed point left in a world that kept sliding sideways beneath him, and in a way she supposed she was. He stood in the firelight with his shoulders drawn up around his ears, ready to run if the wrong word was spoken, and Judd looked him over the way a man looks over stock he means to buy, not unkindly, but thorough, taking in the thinness of the wrists, the hollow under the jaw, the boots gone through at the toe. "How old are you?" Judd said. "9," the boy said, though it came out more breath than voice. Judd nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, and turned to the drover. "Get him a plate. Beans and meat both, and find him a blanket out of the spare kit, the wool, not the canvas." Then, to the boy directly, in a tone Martha had not yet heard him use, plainer than the one he used for business, "You'll ride near the cook wagon from here on. Nobody'll trouble you there." The boy did not thank him. He looked instead to Martha, as if for permission to believe it, and she gave the smallest nod she had in her, and watched something in his narrow chest loosen that had been pulled tight for 3 weeks. Judd did not linger over the tenderness of it. He turned back to business almost at once, telling her the wagon would be readied by morning, and that his foreman would show her where the stores were kept. And his voice was brisk again, a cattleman's voice, counting costs. But she had seen the other thing pass over his face before he covered it, quick as a cloud crossing a low sun, and she understood that a man could be careful with his kindness, the same way she had learned to be careful with her hope, rationing it, so it would last. She looked once more toward the captain's fire, banked low now, unwatched, and then she turned and did not look at it again. "Word travels faster than wagons," Martha's grandmother would say later, "and on a trail, there is nowhere for it to hide." By the second morning, half the train knew that the cattle baron had taken the marked widow into his outfit, had given her a wagon and a wage, had let the boy ride at her side like something worth protecting. By the third morning, the knowing had settled into the women's faces like dust into cloth, and none of them met her eyes when she passed with her water pail, though several found reasons to walk near enough to look. It was the fourth day, gray-skied and threatening rain, when the captain's wife came to her. She did not come as she had come before, upright and certain, her voice pitched for an audience. She came alone, in the hour before the nooning, and she stood a little apart from the wagon, the way a person stands from a fire they are not sure will burn them. "My youngest has taken a fever," she said. "I've nothing left that will bring it down." Martha had willow bark, dried and wrapped in a square of muslin, saved from a stand of trees 3 days back when she had thought only of the boy's cough. She did not make the woman ask twice. She measured out what was needed, showed her how much to steep and for how long, and said nothing of the cook fire, the branding iron, the word marked spoken like a sentence handed down from a bench. The woman took the bark in both hands as though it weighed more than it did. "I'm obliged," she said, and the words came out of her stiff and unpracticed, a coin spent that she had not counted on spending. Martha only nodded. She had learned, in 3 weeks of scraping meals from bone and rind, that there was no profit in a person's shame beyond what it cost her to carry it, and she had no wish to add to anyone's load who had not asked her to. But she watched the woman go, and she felt something settle in her that was not triumph, though it had triumph's shape from a distance. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a sack she had carried so long she had forgotten her shoulder ached under it. By week's end, it was not only the captain's wife. A woman with a broken harness strap came asking after the boy's small, clever hands with a needle. Another, ashamed and unable to hide it, asked whether Martha might spare a portion of cornmeal, as her own stores had run thinner than she'd let on. Each time Martha gave what she had, and each time she watched the asking cost the asker something Martha herself no longer had to pay. The old woman paused there, in the telling, and looked at her hands as though the weeks she was about to describe were written somewhere in the creases of them. By the fourth week, the drovers had stopped complaining about the noon stop being too short, because they had learned that whatever came off the fire was worth waiting for. Word traveled the way water finds a crack, quietly and everywhere at once. Men who had ridden the trail for 11 years and eaten nothing but salt pork and hardtack began drifting toward her fire before it was called, tin plates already in hand, not saying much, just standing close, the way men stand close to warmth in a cold month. She fed them the way she had fed the boy under the wagon, with attention, not abundance, because abundance was not a thing the trail allowed anyone. The boy changed faster than the season did. He had come to her thin as a fence rail, flinching at raised voices, sleeping with his knees drawn to his chest even in the mild nights. Now he carried water without being asked. He learned to skin a rabbit clean in under 2 minutes, and he did it with a kind of fierce pride that made the drovers laugh, not unkindly, and toss him the tougher cuts to practice on. One of Judd's men, a lean rider named for a scar over his eyebrow that nobody asked about, took to teaching him knots in the evenings, and the boy sat cross-legged in the firelight, working rope through his fingers with the same concentration he gave to the onions Martha set him to dicing. He stopped watching the road behind them for whoever might come to take him away. Nobody was coming. He understood that now, the way children understand things, all at once and completely, without needing it explained. Judd himself said little about any of it, which was his way of saying a great deal. He ate what she cooked, and he watched the outfit around him eat it. And once, only once, she saw him set down his plate half-finished and simply sit still for a moment. The way a man sits still when something in him has been fed, that food alone does not reach. He did not speak of it. He only nodded to her, once, across the fire, and rode out at dawn the next day to scout the water ahead, leaving the running of camp entirely in her hands, as though there had never been a question of whether they belonged there. The old woman paused there, the way she always did when the telling reached the place where the years began to run together instead of standing apart as single days. She had told the granddaughter once that this was the hardest part of any story to tell true, not the cruelty, not the fear, but the good stretch afterward, because good stretches did not keep their edges the way bad ones did. They blurred. They folded into each other like dough worked too long. The drive had ended in a river town with more mud than street, and Judd had paid her the $12 a month he'd promised, every month, in coin that did not jingle so much as it weighed. But it was what he did after that mattered more. He put backing behind her, not charity. He was careful she understood the difference. A loan against her own labor, to be repaid. And with it, she'd taken over a sagging roadhouse kitchen at a crossing where drovers and freight wagons both had to stop, whether they liked the company or not. She fed them. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Word travels on a trail the way smoke travels on still air, low and unhurried, but reaching everywhere eventually. And within 2 years, men were riding half a day out of their way for a meal at the widow's table. She hired on help. She built a smokehouse, then a second room, then a barn for the horses of men who stayed the night, rather than push on hungry into the dark. The boy grew taller each season, learned cattle the way he'd once learned knots, with his whole quiet attention, and became the kind of foreman men listened to before they thought to ask why they should. Judd came through twice a year, sometimes 3 times, driving his own herds or simply riding the country the way rich men did who had made their money young enough to grow bored of standing still. He never asked her to marry him. She never offered. What passed between them instead was something neither of them troubled to name: a standing chair at her table, a bottle of good whiskey he brought, and she poured for both of them and no one else. Letters in a hand that did not waste words, arriving maybe 4 times a year, always answered. Partners, she called it, when the girl asked, and left it there. The roadhouse became a ranch the way a creek becomes a river, not in a season, but in the not noticing of many seasons together, until one day there was a name on the gate that had not been there before, and it was hers. The sign came before the name did, though. She always told it in that order, because that was how it happened, and she had no patience for people who rearranged their own lives in the retelling to make themselves look wiser than they'd been. It was Judd who brought the blacksmith out, a lean, silent man named Corliss who worked iron, the way some men prayed, without wasted motion. Judd had described what he wanted in a letter. 4 sentences, no more. Corliss arrived with his tools in a wagon and asked her, plain as asking the time, to press her hand flat into a tray of wet sand so he could take the shape of it. She had not shown her hands to a stranger without flinching in 11 years. She showed them to him. He studied the print the way a man studies a brand before he burns it into a hide. The ridge of scar tissue where 3 fingers had fused slightly at the second knuckle. The long pale seam across the palm where the wagon canvas had dripped fire onto her 20 years before. He did not comment on any of it. He only nodded, the way a craftsman nods at a piece of good grain in a plank, and went to work. The sign came back 3 weeks later. Black iron, a foot across, the handprint raised in relief across its face. Her handprint, scars and all, cast permanent in metal, that would outlast her by 100 years if no one dropped it in a river. Judd hung it himself over the roadhouse door, standing on a crate to reach, and did not say anything about it either, which was its own kind of saying. For 19 years it hung there, through weather that took the paint off 3 different doors beneath it, through the roadhouse becoming a kitchen, becoming a ranch house, through cooks who came and went, and cowhands who ate, standing at her counter with their hats in their hands, out of something that was not quite manners and not quite fear. When they built the new hearth room, wide enough for the whole crew at branding time, Corliss's grandson, an old man himself by then, came out to take the sign down and reset it above the new mantle, and he handled it the way his grandfather had handled the wet sand, careful, unbothered, as if a scarred hand cast in iron were the most ordinary thing in the world to hang above a fire. It hung there still. The girl had walked under it 1,000 times without asking what it was. She was going to ask tonight. The old woman's voice had gone quiet by the time she finished. Quiet the way a fire goes when the wood is spent, but the coals still hold their heat. The girl sat with her knees pulled up on the bench, her sleeve pushed to the elbow without anyone asking her to push it. The mark on her arm was pale brown, shaped like nothing in particular, the kind of thing a cruel child could find 100 names for and had, that very afternoon, in the schoolyard, in front of enough other children, that the names would likely outlive the reason for them. The old woman held out her hands, palms up, the way she had not held them out to anyone in a long while. The scars had gone silver white with age, thin as the skin over them, crossed with the ordinary spots of 74 years, but the shape of them was the same shape it had always been. The shape the fire had left when she was a young woman with a dead husband and no place at a cook fire. "Look there," she said, and nodded toward the hearth, where the iron sign hung black against the stone, the handprint pressed into it, plain as the day Corliss's father had pulled it from the sand. The girl looked. She looked a long time, longer than a child usually looks at anything, and something in her face moved the way water moves when the wind finally reaches it after a still morning. "It's the same," she said. "It is. They put it on the wall." "They did. Man who mocked me for it never got his name on anything." "The hand did." The girl did not ask what that meant. She understood it the way a person understands weather, without needing it explained, and she pulled her sleeve back down, not out of shame this time, but because the evening had turned cool and there was supper to get to. They went to the pot together. The old woman's hands were steady, steadier than they had any right to be at her age, and she guided the girl's smaller ones around the wooden spoon, showed her the pinch of salt held high so it fell even, the way she had learned it once from no one, out of nothing, over a fire she'd had no right to. "Taste it," the old woman said. The girl tasted it, and made a face, and reached for more salt without being told, and the old woman laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind she did not give often, and said nothing more about scars, or signs, or schoolyards, because the pot was what there was to attend to, and the attending was the whole of the lesson, and neither of them needed to say so out loud.